Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. And I ask, can the Prime Minister confirm that he suggested to the New South Wales Premier that the scope of the bushfire recovery clean-up funding proposal by New South Wales was not consistent with the Black Saturday framework in a bid to reduce the cost to the federal government?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I confirmed to the journalists who put this same matter to us on the weekend, the proposal I put to the New South Wales Premier was the proposal that was adopted, and the proposal that was announced, the proposal that was arranged between the Treasurer and the Treasurer of New South Wales and the head of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency and their counterpart in New South Wales. What we proposed is what was announced.
The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is it important to have a clear and balanced plan to meet our environmental commitments to reduce emissions while supporting
Members on my left. The member for Mackellar will resume his seat. The member for Burt, the member for Rankin and others will cease interjecting, or I'll have to start ejecting them. The member for Mackellar can begin his question from the top.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is it important to have a clear and balanced plan to meet our environmental commitments to reduce emissions while supporting our economy to create jobs by reducing taxes, reducing electricity prices and supporting the economies of rural and regional communities? And how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Mackellar for his question, and I commend him on his editorial on the weekend. Mr Speaker, this year, under our government, Australia will meet our 2020 Kyoto emissions reduction target. And we won't just meet it, Mr Speaker, we will beat it by 411 million tonnes, which is the equivalent of about 80% of Australia's annual total national emissions. Now, Mr Speaker, Labor sought to achieve that target when they were in government by having a carbon tax that they promised they wouldn't implement. Now, Mr Speaker, 10 years ago, when we were in opposition, we set out a plan as to how we would meet that 2020 target without a carbon tax. And, Mr Speaker, we took that plan 10 years out. At the election, we took it to the election, and Australians endorsed the plan to reduce emissions without having a carbon tax. And today, Mr Speaker, the plan we outlined in opposition 10 years ago is the plan that has ensured that we've met our Kyoto commitments 10 years later here in 2020. Now also, Mr Speaker, some 50 million tonnes on average less a year are our emissions now than they were under the average of the Labor government. Renewable energy is at record levels in terms of investment, and electricity prices have fallen some 3.5% in the last year. And, Mr Speaker, we did this all without a carbon tax, and we did it all, Mr Speaker, while at the same time increasing the number of jobs in this country by over 1.5 million. Mr Speaker, we are taking the same balanced approach when it comes to meeting our 2030 commitments, a balanced plan that's about technology, not taxation. Mr Speaker, a plan that is investing in new technologies and energy sources like hydrogen, investing in the Snowy scheme, investing in hydropower investments in Tasmania, investing in transmission lines. Now, I'm asked about alternatives. Those opposite can't agree, Mr Speaker, on what they want to do on 2030, so how can you trust them about what they want to do 30 years from now? How can you trust someone, Mr Speaker, who hasn't been able to deliver a surplus in 30 years, and now they want to tell you what they're going to do about emissions in 30 years, Mr Speaker? This Labor opposition, Mr Speaker, is the same bill you couldn't afford at the last election, and they're the same bill you can't afford now, Mr Speaker. They are reheat of the failed policies that was offered to the Australian people at the last election. At the last election, Mr Speaker, our balanced plan was endorsed, those opposites' plan was rejected, and it's the same reheat they're forcing on the Australian people now.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Isn't it the case the Cabinet committed to net zero emissions by 2050 when it signed up to the Paris Agreement?
The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, thank you, Mr Speaker. No, that's incorrect. We
Members on the
signed up
left.
to the Paris Agreement. We signed up to the Paris Agreement, which involves the world achieving net zero in the second half of the century, Mr Speaker. That was our commitment. And of course, we have strong targets, we have a clear plan, and we have an enviable track record, as we've just heard from the Prime Minister.
The member for Lyons, member for Perth. Does the Minister for Health want to cease interjecting so that we can get back on with question time? The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to reduce emissions to meet our international commitments? And what are the risks of alternative approaches?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, and I acknowledge his strong focus on reducing emissions, and of course doing that while we maintain a strong economy. And he knows the way to do that is to take real and practical action, Mr Speaker, and that's through technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker. Technology, not taxes. Now, Mr Speaker, we'll meet and beat our Kyoto 2020 targets by 411 million tonnes, as we've just heard from the Prime Minister, 80% of a year's worth of emissions, Mr Speaker, having inherited a 700 million tonne deficit when we got into government. And, Mr Speaker, we have a strong 2030 target,
Member for Dunkley.
and according to the December emissions projections, we'll meet and beat those targets as well, Mr Speaker. And according to emissions data that's come out today, in the domestic economy we've seen a 2.3% reduction in emissions this year. In the total economy we've seen reductions, and of course in the national electricity market, Mr Speaker, we've seen a 3.2% reduction to the lowest level of emissions in our electricity market since records began. Now, Mr Speaker, right at the heart of that is world-leading investment in renewables, and increasingly we're seeing a focus on dispatchable power to drive down wholesale prices, which have come down 35% year on year in the last 12 months. Now, Mr Speaker, I was asked if there was an alternative approach. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has announced a target for 2050, and taking a leaf out of the member for Maribyrnong's book, he's done it without outlining his plan to get there, Mr Speaker. They've failed to front up and look miners, farmers, manufacturers and truck drivers in the eye and to tell them what the implications are of those targets, Mr Speaker. Now, today we've had members of the opposition out citing the CSIRO Australian National Outlook 2019 report to back up their target and describe what their plan really is. Well, let me let the House in on a little secret on what's in that report, Mr Speaker. It models a $273 carbon price, Mr Speaker, a $273 carbon price, and it slashes the sheep industry, the beef industry, cropping, decimating country towns, Mr Speaker, and of course putting regional Australians out of a job. And the member for Crowe will be happy to know that the report sees the end, the death of the coal industry. We know where this ends, Mr Speaker, with a massive carbon tax slashing jobs, incomes and the Australian economy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Liberal Premier of New South Wales that her government's target of net zero emissions by 2050 is consistent with both the Paris Agreement and the federal government's own commitment to the Paris Agreement?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, well, I refer the member to the answer by the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, which spells out very clearly what the government has signed up to in terms of the Paris Agreement. And I'm asked about the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker, and our commitment is 26% reduction in emissions over 2005. And I'm pleased to tell the House that as of the most recent report, that is now down by 13.1%, which means we're half the way there, Mr Speaker, and we have a plan to meet the 2030 commitment. The only problem is when I look at what those opposite are talking about, they have no idea what they want to commit to for 2030. They say, well, I don't know whether I'll tell you before the election or I won't. They want to talk about things 30 years from now. They can't even agree on what they want to do 10 years from now, Mr Speaker. Now, when we're in opposition, we set out a 10-year plan.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Dunkley is warned, as is the member for Shortland. Leader of the Opposition just bears with me for a second. I'll just get a few of these warnings down. And the member for Scullin will cease interjecting, and the Leader of the Opposition, I guess, on a point of order.
You guessed correctly, Mr Speaker.
No, just state the point of order.
It's on relevance. He hasn't mentioned Gladys Berejiklian once.
The
and her
Leader of the
commitment
Opposition
to net zero by 2050.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat, and as he well knows, the Prime Minister is not compelled to mention anyone by name, particularly if the name wasn't in the question. So that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, so I'm asked about the Paris Agreement and I'm asked about a 2050 zero carbon commitment, Mr Speaker. I'll tell you what, on this side of the House, because this is what we took to the Australian people, we said we'd hit a 26% reduction by 2030. We have a clear plan to achieve that, Mr Speaker. Those opposite won't even tell you what their 2030 commitment is because of the Otis Group, and now we've got the Milo Group, which I assume has been established, Mr Speaker, to counteract the Otis Group, and they've put a big slap down on the Otis Group, Mr Speaker, with the ill-timed and ill-prepared commitment which the Leader of the Opposition has made on the weekend, Mr Speaker. What I do know is this, is that Australians will always pay the price for Labor's ill-considered decisions. They will pay the price of a plan that doesn't even exist for 2050, and they can't even tell you what they would do 10 years from now. So how could you believe anything they say about what would happen 30 years from now? This is a classic example of the Labor leader trying to have it both ways, Mr Speaker. He won't tell you what's happening in 2030. He wants to tell you what's happening on 2050. There's no details, there's no plan, there's no specificity. He just says, trust us, we're Labor. Trust us, we're Labor. Well, last time the Australian people trusted Labor when it came to climate, Mr Speaker, they said there wouldn't be a carbon tax, and then they went and delivered a carbon tax, breaking their promise. I tell you what I won't do. I'm not going to make a promise to Australians. I'm not going to put a tax on them to get emissions down. I'm not going to take away their jobs the way the Leader of the Opposition wants to do. I'm not going to turn my back on workers in rural and regional Australia, Mr Speaker, who depend on the commitments that we've made. I'm not going to jack their electricity prices up, Mr Speaker, in the way they doubled under the Labor government. They doubled under the Labor government, Mr Speaker. Electricity prices have fallen 3.5% as a result of the policies that we've put in place.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded.
You always pay the bill.
The member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister. Since we're hearing about who can tell the Australian people what they are planning, since you are in government, and the climate is on track to 3 degrees of heating on current emission reduction commitments, to ensure sensible economic management of Australia's economy Has the government assessed the cost of jobs and the economy of the outcome of 3 degrees of heating, and what is that cost?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. The issues that she has raised is why our government is taking action on climate change. That is why, Mr Speaker. That is why we signed up to the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker, and we've made our commitment
Prime Minister
to reduce
will just
our
pause
emissions.
for a second. The member for Corangamite will leave under Standing Order 94A. Yes. Yes, that's right. I asked you to cease interjecting. I warned you. You kept interjecting, and now you're leaving. That's the way it works. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That is why our government is taking action on climate change. That is why we signed up to the Paris Agreement, and that's why we're meeting our targets. As I said, we're meeting the Kyoto targets, which those opposite, I must note, that when we announced 10 years ago, Mr Speaker, our plan to achieve the Kyoto emissions reduction targets, it was mocked by those opposite. They said you couldn't do it without a carbon tax. It was mocked by others around this place, Mr Speaker, but I tell you what, it wasn't mocked by the Australian people, because they backed that plan at the 2013 election, 7 years out from that 2020 target, and we delivered on that commitment, and we have not only beaten, but we have beaten our targets
The Prime Minister
by
will
2020.
resume his seat. The member for Solomon is warned. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Yes, relevance. The question went to what is the cost?
Yes, as I often point out, member for Warringah can resume her seat. The question had a long preamble, and what did? I mean, it did. I mean, I don't want to have an argument with the member for Warringah, but I listened very carefully, and there was quite a long preamble before she got to a very specific question. If you need the answer to be tightly to the specific question, you need to not have the broad preamble that allows the Minister or the Prime Minister answering it to range more widely. The Prime Minister is in order.
Speaker, it is because we do understand there are costs associated with climate change that we indeed are taking action on climate change to reduce emissions, Mr Speaker. But I tell you what also we need to do to take action on climate change, and that is we need to build the resilience of this country for the climate that we need to live in, that we will live in, for the economy that we must grow in this climate and in the environment we are in, Mr Speaker, and we need to put in place the adaptation measures to ensure that Australians can thrive in the climate we will live in, Mr Speaker. While taking the action, the necessary action when it comes to emission reduction, we will also take action on building the dams, which means climate action now, Mr Speaker. The hazard reduction, which is climate action now, Mr Speaker, just as emissions reduction is climate action now. And we will take those actions because we understand the risks and the need to take action in relation to those risks. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, don't offer any plans. They don't offer any policies. They have an uncosted, glib.
No, I just say to the Prime Minister. I just say to the Prime Minister, members can cease interjecting just for a second. It's very difficult for the Prime Minister to go to the policies of those opposite when, one, he wasn't asked about it, and two, the question was from an independent. So the Prime Minister either needs to wrap his answer up, or the Prime Minister has the call.
I'm happy to do that, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about the costs. I'm asked about the costs of climate, Mr Speaker. What I can assure the Australian people is they will always pay the price of Labor's failed climate policies.
The member for Barker has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Deputy Prime Minister, how is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support the more efficient transport of freight across the country and to connect with overseas markets? And how does this compare against the risks of alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, and firstly I'll set out our approach to making sure that we've got the right infrastructure in place to help our national freight task, Mr Speaker. And the member for Barker is right. We are approaching this in a very diligent and practical manner, as you would expect us to, with $100 billion over the next 10 years to ensure that we've got the right supply chain strategies in place, to make sure that we've got the right rail, indeed, with the Inland Rail, a $9.3 billion investment, to make sure that we've got the right road network in place. And I'm sure the member for Barker and other regional members are absolutely delighted with the $4 billion, up by $1 billion in last year's budget for the roads of strategic importance. Mr Speaker, that is playing such a critical pathway in making sure that we get product from paddock to port to plate, wherever that might be, Mr Speaker, wherever that might be, whether it's in our new markets that we've established, Mr Speaker, whether it's indeed in our domestic markets, Mr Speaker. The Roads of Strategic Importance initiative includes $32.4 million to improve agriculture export systems and $70 million to develop an advanced train management system in order, Mr Speaker, to improve supply chain efficiency. That's all part of the $100 billion we're spending on our transport networks, on our infrastructure, Mr Speaker. And with the member for Barker, he knows that Whyalla Steel is being used in the Inland Rail, Mr Speaker. He knows that in his home state of South Australia, the government has invested $252 million into the Adelaide to Tarcoola re-railing upgrade. And he asked me about alternative approaches. And alternative approaches are writ large across opposite, Mr Speaker. Those opposite, Mr Speaker. They've got the owners group. They're so divided over there, Mr Speaker. So divided, Mr Speaker. And they will remember, Mr Speaker, May 18 last year. May 18, when they took a wrecking ball to the people of Australia and promised that they were going to take away those the investors who were investing in real estate, those people who had retired and were working towards having a proper state of living, Mr Speaker. They took that and now they've got zero net emissions by 2015. And I challenge those opposite to go and look a farmer in the eye and say, how are you going to produce zero net emissions and still produce the $100 billion task that we've got by 2030? Indeed, look a steer or a wether in the eye and say, how are you going to stop your methane production, Mr Speaker? That's indeed what they're challenging farmers and their stock to do, Mr Speaker. They're going to ruin the resources sector. They're going to, and look a truckie in the eye while you're at it. How are you going to make sure that you get zero net emissions? It's a tax on farms, it's a tax on transport, it's a tax on the checkout, it's a tax on Australians trying to work hard and make ends meet.
Members on my right, the member for Cooper. Members on my right. The member for Hunter has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer. Is the government aware that both the National Farmers Federation and Meat and Livestock Australia have plans for their sectors to be carbon neutral by 2030?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
I can tell you what they do have a plan to do, and that is increase agriculture by to $100 billion from the $60 billion that it is now. And if ever there was a friend of the farmers, if ever there was a friend of the National Farmers Federation, it is the Liberal and Nationals who sit on this side of the House. And we sit on this side of the House, and you may well laugh, member for Rankin. I mean, you wanted to totally destroy agriculture. And the member for Watson there, he wanted to take away water from our irrigators. The member for Hunter, he got the biggest wake-up call on May 18 last year. And all of a sudden, he's discovered farmers. He's discovered his regional roots.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, the question didn't go to any alternative policies. The question didn't go to any alternative policies, and the Deputy Prime Minister needs to confine his answer to the question that was asked. Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
NFF CEO Tony Maher has actually said that there's been no consultation from those opposite with their reckless plan, their irresponsible plan. Mr Speaker,
the Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. Deputy Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it was a very specific question. It went to whether the Deputy Prime Minister was aware that the NFF and Meat and Livestock Australia both plan for their sectors to be carbon neutral by 2030.
Will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House seeking the call.
There was no mention of what the point of order in the standing orders was, and
members on my.
It was. We have the leader of the opposition taking a non-point of order when it should have been the leader of the Rebel Alliance.
Well, I mean, I point out to the Leader of the House that he is right, but given that the Leader of the Opposition directly followed a ruling I made with respect to the question, and I've been fairly lenient. I mean, the reason ministers are able to canvass alternative policies is because they're asked about them. And if you're not asked about them, I allow a little bit of tolerance for compare and contrast. But given 10 questions come from my right-hand side, I think there's ample opportunity. And when there is a specific question, as this one was, the Deputy Prime Minister needs to confine himself to the question that's been asked.
Mr Speaker, I'm aware that the meat and livestock people, the NFF people, are wanting to make sure that they grow agriculture to $100 billion by 2030. And how you do that is you've got the right policies in place. And they know that in this government we've got the right policies in place, and we'll make sure that we continue to put those right policies in place. I realise he's had his road to Damascus moment. I realise the member for Hunter has all of a sudden seen the light.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to reduce electricity prices and ensure stability in our electricity grid? And how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. I was in her electorate last week, and she is relentlessly focused on delivering a fair deal for Australians on energy, on households, on small businesses, on industry in her electorate, her part of the world. Now, Mr Speaker, she knows we took to the election a plan for a fair deal for all Australians on energy. And since then, we've been delivering just that, Mr Speaker. We've introduced price caps. We've ensured there's more supply coming into the market, Mr Speaker. We've established a retailer reliability obligation. We're doing more on gas, and we're making sure customers can get the best deal through both price caps, the default market offer, and reference prices, Mr Speaker. And as a result, we are seeing prices coming down, Mr Speaker. The CPI tells us that for 4 consecutive quarters we've seen electricity price reductions totalling 3.5% for the first time since records have begun. And on top of that, Mr Speaker, wholesale prices are down. In the last 3 months, we've seen wholesale prices 35% below where they were year on year in the previous year. And in South Australia, the members' electorate, Mr Speaker, wholesale prices are down 50% in the last quarter on the previous year. 50%. We have a good government in South Australia working with the federal government to make sure those prices are coming down, Mr Speaker. And of course she knows that a fair deal on energy alongside emissions reductions is best achieved through technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker. Technology, not taxes. Last week, in her electorate in Tonsley, we announced the establishment of the Australian Hydrogen Centre, which is all part of our National Hydrogen Strategy. $500 million we've committed since announcing that strategy at COAG late last year, Mr Speaker. But I was asked if there was another option, and there is. There is. And he's sitting right there, Mr Speaker. He's sitting right there next door to the member for Hindmarsh, their election-losing machine, Mr Speaker, because he's focused on driving up the cost of living pressures and business costs for all Australians. Now, he talked about the target they took to the last election as a mistake. But he's doing it all over again, Mr Speaker. It's deja vu all over again. Setting a target without a plan. Setting a target without a plan, Mr Speaker. And they don't want to tell Australians what their plan is because we know what it involves. It involves a carbon tax, a tax on fuel, a tax on electricity, a tax on gas and a tax on farmers, Mr Speaker. We will not stand for it. It always comes back to a carbon tax, but on top of that, it comes back to pink bats, green loans and cash for clunkers, Mr Speaker. Those opposite have no plan, no policies and no idea.
Just before I call the member for Rankin, I'd just like to inform members we have present in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon the former Premier of New South Wales, Honourable Nick Greiner. Welcome. The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction, and I refer to the Prime Minister's earlier failure to answer the question from the member for Warringah. Has the government modelled the economic impact of failing to meet its Paris Agreement commitment of net zero emissions by 2050?
The Minister has the call. Members on both sides, the Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, that's not what's in the Paris Agreement. Article 4.1 is very clear. It is about global commitment to reach net zero in the second half of the century, Mr Speaker. And our commitment, the commitment that is more immediate, more pressing and that we're focused on, is achieving our 2030 targets, Mr Speaker, a 26% reduction. A 26% reduction, Mr Speaker. Now, we have clear targets, we have a strong plan and we have an enviable track record, Mr Speaker. And that enviable track record does not involve imposing a carbon tax, Mr Speaker. It's about technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker.
Has the Minister concluded his answer? Yeah. Has the Minister concluded his answer? Yeah. The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support our farmers and agricultural producers? Will the Minister outline how this compares against the risks of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Nichols for his question and the contribution that the Nichols electorate makes to the agricultural sector in helping us reach the $100 billion goal by 2030. And our job with respect to hitting that is to put the framework around our primary producers to make sure they're empowered to reach that goal. We've done that with the trade agreements with Japan, Korea, China, Peru, Hong Kong, Indonesia. 243 million people on our doorstep that are now giving us market access, reducing the tariffs, opening up the commodities to allow our farmers to have access and spread their risks, and also the TPP-11, the $13 trillion marketplace that those opposite don't worry about that, just forget about it, it's all too hard. But we stuck the course and we got access to another market that those opposite recklessly walked away from, forgetting about the agricultural sector, didn't give a hoot. But then we continued to say that we have to empower our farmers to be the best environmental stewards that they are. We've put $34 million into a biodiversity stewardship fund to trial to pay the farmers, not just for their carbon abatement, but also for the improvement in biodiversity, empowering them to look after the environment and to grow better food and fibre in the world. But we've also said about bringing our young people home. We've lost generations of young people out of agriculture and out of regional rural Australia, and we're saying we're going to increase the innovation, to modernise our innovation, to bring our young people back to agriculture, bring them back to regional rural Australia. We're saying to them there's the new jobs of agriculture, not just the traditional ones, the pick and shovel, but the new jobs in science and technology, empowering them to come back and empower our farmers with the tools to be able to adapt. But what they want to be able to do that is certainty. Certainty in policy settings, and in one foul swoop, those opposite, in a reckless act against young people that are empowered to want to come back to regional Australia, have put a carbon emissions of zero by 2050 that says you will not have a future. because the only way that they will achieve that is through culling the national herd or putting in place draconian vegetation management laws that will lock up the productivity of agriculture, that will rip the heart out of regional and rural Australia. This is a reckless, heartless attack on regional and rural Australians. And let me just put the member for Hunter back in his place. When he misappropriately quoted the NFF president, if he'd like to read, his comments are, NFF is in the process of considering its climate policy, which does not currently include a specific position on net carbon zero by 2050. However, the industry would have real difficulty in supporting any target proposal. There you have it. You have actually misrepresented the NFF in one of the lowest acts I have seen by a shadow agriculture minister.
Member for Rankin. I think you're fine. You've got a colleague wanting to ask a question. I haven't called you yet. I'm being very patient. Member for Hindmarsh.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government's climate change policy still being driven by extreme climate sceptics on its backbench when net zero emissions by 2050 is supported by 73 countries, including the UK, Canada, France and Germany, every Australian state and territory, the Business Council of Australia, our largest airline, our largest bank, our largest mining company and our largest telecommunications company?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I simply make the observation that the shadow minister responsible for that portfolio area can't even get 20 of his own backbench, Mr Speaker, to agree on a 2030 target for emissions reduction, something that we did when we were in opposition, and he, as a shadow minister, can't even get a unity amongst his own backbench on being able to say what happens 10 years from now. So he's had to punt it right down the other end of the field out to 2050 because it's going to take them 30 years to agree on anything on that side, Mr Speaker, when it comes to emissions reduction. So tonight they'll go out to their restaurants, they'll go out to Otis, or they'll go out wherever they'll go, they'll get into their huddles, Mr Speaker, and there will be a yawning gap when it comes to climate policy on that side. If you can't say what you're going to do in 10 years, Mr Speaker, how can they honestly be trusted about what they say is going to happen in 30 years? But they've raised some of the other countries. Even the New Zealand government was smart enough, Mr Speaker, not to include the agricultural sector when it came to their net zero emissions. Now, it only happens to be 34%, Mr Speaker, of the emissions in New Zealand, and they make reference to those in Europe, Mr Speaker, and those who are leaving Europe. But I note that the European community, who has made that commitment, has given Europe's largest coal-generating country, Poland, an exemption, Mr Speaker. An exemption! An exemption! Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition was so desperate to slap down at the urging of the Milo Group, Mr Speaker, to slap down the Otis Group, Mr Speaker, that he rushed out on the weekend and he said, no, I promise 2050, Mr Speaker, 2050. I'll make sure that those rebels over there won't get their say and I'll slap them down. This Leader of the Opposition is in charge of his opposition, Mr Speaker. It is a rabble of views when it comes to the issue of climate policy. What I do know is this, is the bill you couldn't afford at the last election, Mr Speaker, is repeated by this Labor policy under this Labor leader. It is a reheat of the bill they couldn't afford before and they still can't afford it now. No plan. Zero assessment of the costs, zero assessment of the impacts, zero consultation, whether it be farmers or others, Mr Speaker, zero positive news for the Australian people who will be hit by a policy, if those off it were ever elected, with a higher price on electricity, a higher price on farming, a higher price on the checkout, Mr Speaker, a higher price on transport and petrol, Mr Speaker. A higher price is always what you'll pay under Labor, who just can't manage money.
The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support our farmers to ensure they can deliver the food and fibre Australia needs? And how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches for Australians at the checkout when they are buying their groceries?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Lynn for his question and the contribution also his electorate makes to the agricultural sector and to our community in underpinning the best food and fibre in the world being produced right here in Australia, giving not only the rest of the world confidence, but giving our own consumers that confidence. And we as a federal government has supported that through significant investments in biosecurity, making sure that we keep those pests out that are foreign to our farmers, to keep them out to protect our image, because that means that we're able to command a higher price, not only internationally, but making sure that our consumers have confidence in and the product that they are consuming. We've gone a step further with respect to the country of origin labelling. We've taken the green and gold kangaroo and we've given a greater currency with a barcode underneath it so that consumers, when they go to the supermarket, they can make sure they have a clear understanding of the level of Australian ingredient in it. We're empowering consumers to support Australian farmers, to make that decision at the checkout, to be able to go in with confidence and understand that they are consuming the best produce in the world because it's come from an Australian farmer. That's about putting a framework around our farmers, but also our consumers. But we've gone another step with respect to our infrastructure spend. Our job as a federal government is to put the environment and infrastructure around our people and our farmers, and we've done that now with the infrastructure that we're putting in place with roads, rail, with airports, to make sure that our produce gets to these supermarkets as quickly as it possibly can, to ensure that our Australian consumers get that produce as quickly as possible. But there's a real threat to that. And that came only on the weekend with, again, the reckless policy of the zero emissions, because it's not just farmers they're going on. They put a gun to the Australian agricultural head and said, we don't believe in supporting you. We are going to take you out. We're going to put you in the place of this. But now they're going after a checkout tax, because every consumer will pay for this, not just at the farm gate. They will also pay for this.
Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order.
Speaker, I think it would be a really good idea if we avoided violent analogies like that one.
The Minister might just withdraw that, and thank the Minister. You can continue.
Well, it is a serious issue. I take the objection. Yeah. But let me say, what they are creating is a checkout tax, because it's not just the farm sector that will be penalised, it'll be the processing sector. 21% of the cost of processing the beef is for transport and energy. And what those opposite will do is lift that portion of it up again. And what that means is consumers will pay for this at the checkout. It's a checkout tax. And the member for Hunter interjects. He had this brave moment of the political near-death experience he had after 18th of May. He crawled out from under that rock that he was hiding for 6 years, and now all of a sudden the left of the party has put their thumb back on his forehead and pushed him back under that rock he came from. For all the bravado that he had after the election, he sold out the coal workers in Hunter. He sold out the agricultural sector because he's just not strong enough.
The Leader of the Opposition. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. So far in this parliament, the Prime Minister has used his numbers to shut down debate with me on 42 occasions. If the Prime Minister is so confident of his position, will he agree to a climate change debate at the National Press Club before the climate change conference in Glasgow this year?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's all about you, Albo, isn't it, mate? It's all about you. When we come here into this place and all the Leader of the Opposition can complain about, Mr Speaker, is he can't get his 15 minutes of fame, Mr Speaker. What an indulgent Leader of the Opposition. I tell you what, Mr Speaker, if you want to sit in this chair, you've got to put the Australian people first, not yourself first, and worry about how much airtime you're getting, Mr Speaker. The problem with the Leader of the Opposition is he's so focused on the bubble politics of Canberra and all of this, he even forgets his own record. This is how many closures he moved when he was sitting on the government side. Mr Speaker, 44 in 2008, 33 in 2009, 18 in 2010, 11, they didn't even have the numbers then, 11, 33 in 2012, 13, Mr Speaker, in 2016. That's 152, Mr Speaker. 152. Mr Speaker, there'll be debates before the next election, and if you can last long enough to see me there, I'll see you there.
Members on my right. The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support Australian manufacturers to remain competitive and create jobs, and how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question and acknowledge her as a champion of manufacturing in her electorate. Now, her electorate, like many of the electorates right across Australia, but especially in regional Australia, has a very strong manufacturing base. So businesses like Chamberlain Australia, that manufactures garage door openers in West Gosford. Now, Chamberlain Australia has received support and mentoring from the federal government to help them to grow their businesses. Now, in the last financial year alone, their revenue increased by 11% to $52.8 million, and they're now aiming to grow sales to the Middle East from $2 million to $10 million by the end of this year. And, Mr Speaker, I would be very confident that they just didn't pluck that $10 million figure out of the air, having no idea how they were going to get there. They would have worked through how their business was going to expand, how their business was going to grow, because most businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises, understand that you actually have to have a plan and a way to get to where you want to be, just not make a big announcement at the end. Now, Mr Speaker, Labor is always putting out doomsday media releases that talk down Australian manufacturing. But the fact is that total manufacturing exports have increased by almost $1 billion in the year to December 2019, and that's close to a 10% increase in 12 months. Now, Mr Speaker, we are continuing to back Australian manufacturing businesses. We announced the $160 million Manufacturing Modernisation Fund. Now, this fund is going to help our small and medium manufacturers to grow, to upgrade, to upskill, so that they can continue to compete globally and also to create some local jobs for us. Now, manufacturing businesses are certainly benefiting from our balanced plan to manage the economy, to reduce taxes, to cut red tape and to keep energy prices down. Now, when I speak to manufacturers across Australia, the single biggest issue that they have is the cost of their inputs, particularly the cost of energy to them. Now, it is one of the most significant issues, and those opposite are only promising that they're going to increase energy pricing. What they have offered is an uncosted, headline-grabbing policy. Now, this is a policy offering, Mr Speaker, from the Labor Party. Now, what have they delivered in the past for us? They have delivered pink bats, green loans, cash for clunkers and a carbon tax.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Prime Minister. Why did $2.5 billion out of $3 billion of the Prime Minister's Urban Congestion Fund go to projects in Liberal seats and seats targeted by the Liberal government? Does traffic congestion stop when commuters hit a road that is not on his list of partisan political priorities?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A very ironic question coming from the member for Ballarat, given the views of the Auditor-General on her performance. Well, let me remind the member of the following, Mr Speaker. In the electorate of McMahon, $95 million for the Horsley Drive. In the electorate of Dobell, $6.635 million for 16 projects under the Central Coast Roads projects. In the member for Moreton's electorate, $73 million for the Coopers Plain level crossing removal. In the electorates of Corwell and McEwen, Mr Speaker, $70 million for Northern Line's commuter car parking. In the electorate of Gorton and McEwen, $50 million for upgrades to the Calder Freeway and the M80 Ring Road. There was $50 million for upgrades to the Hume Freeway and M80 Ring Road, also in McEwen. In Fraser and Gorton, $50 million for upgrades on the Western Freeway and the M80 Ring Road. Fraser and Gorton in Western Australia, across multiple Labor electorates. There's not too many of them there, I confess, but $50 million for the transforming freeways and the widening the introduction of the ITS Kwinana and Mitchell freeways. In South Australia, in the electorate of Adelaide, $115 million for the Torrens Road level crossing removal. In Macon, $6.5 million for the Main North Road, Kings Road, McIntyre Road intersection upgrade. In the electorate of Adelaide and Macon, there's $9.5 million for the Grand Junction Road, Hampston Road intersection upgrade. In the electorate of Adelaide, also another $9.5 million for the Main Road, North Road, Nottage Terrace Junction intersection upgrade, Mr Speaker. In Tasmania, there was some $25 million in the electorates of Clark and Franklin for the Hobart congestion package. In Franklin, there was $10 million for the Tasman Highway Intelligent Transport Solutions, and in Bass and Lyons, lines held by the Labor Party, $1.5 million for Launceston Eastern Bice-First study in Launceston, Mr Speaker. I do know, though, that, Mr Speaker, under the program run by the member for Ballarat when she was minister, that the Auditor-General found that she deliberately, Mr Speaker— sure.
Members on my right. Just before I call the member for Ballarat, I refer her to my earlier rulings during the last sitting fortnight on points of order. I now call the member for Ballarat on a point of order.
Yes, I see the Prime Minister wants to talk about audit reports. I didn't actually ask him
will leave
about
the chamber under 94A. No, the member will leave under 94A. I haven't called the Prime Minister. I want to make it very clear I'm not going to have political debate on points of order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, to conclude, I note in that Auditor-General's report I referred to, 80% of ministerial decisions—
seats. No, the Manager of Opposition Business is raising a point of order.
Point of order, and direct relevance hasn't been raised during the answer to this question. What the Prime Minister is now going to is not directly relevant to what he was asked.
I just say to the Prime Minister, this was on the point of order. Yeah,
Speaker, I was asked on the point of order.
Yes.
I was asked about the allegation that the government had been acting against non-government electorates. Now, Mr Speaker, I think it entitles me to compare and contrast the actions of those opposite on those matters.
I just say to the Prime Minister that's right, but my rulings on this have been pretty clear. You can briefly compare and contrast. There's 55 seconds to go, and I can assure you it is my pledge you will not spend 55 seconds doing that. No, you won't. The Prime Minister has
I can
the call.
assure you, I'll just simply note summary point 15 of that report of the then Minister. 80% of ministerial decisions to not award funding to application recommended by the advisory panel related to projects located in coalition-held electorates. The former minister's hypocrisy is outstanding.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Minister, how is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support our exporters, and how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Herbert for his question and for his passion for trade. He understands that 1 in 4 jobs in regional and rural areas are dependent on trade, 1 in 5 right across the nation, and that's why he backed a $75 million investment into the Townsville port, which will see us grow our trade from that port. Mr Speaker, we went to the last election with a balanced plan when it came to trade. We were going to implement the Peru and the Hong Kong FTA, the Indonesia FTA, and we're on the way following the fantastic visit by the President of Indonesia. We said we would get closer economic relations with India, and as we speak, the Minister for Trade is in India with 100 companies, making sure that we strengthen our relationship with India when it comes to trade. We also said we would pursue FTAs with Mexico, Chile, Peru and Colombia through the Pacific Alliance, and we've begun those negotiations and they're going extremely well. We said we would pursue free trade agreements with the EU and with the UK, and the Minister for Trade is already undertaking discussions on both those agreements. Mr Speaker, at the last election we said we would grow coverage from 70% to 90% for those countries we're doing trade with through our free trade agreement, and we are on target to meet that. We took a plan, a balanced plan, to the last election, and we're pursuing it. Now, I'm asked about alternative approaches, and on the weekend we heard about Labor's uncosted, untested, no planned approach to zero emissions by 2050. Now, if you were in a trade-exposed, emissions-intensive industry on the weekend, you would be asking yourself, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to me? Are we going to face a new tax on our industry? Now, what are those trade-exposed, emissions-intensive sectors? Aluminium, glass, cement, printing, steel, the abattoir sector. Now, Mr Speaker, I said before, trade delivers jobs for 1 in 4 people in regional Australia. All those industries are in regional areas. So those people who are working in those sectors would be asking themselves today and asking themselves in the weeks and months ahead, how can we trust Labor? What will this do to my family budget? What will this do to my job? They will be asking themselves, why would you trust Labor on anything, especially when it comes to protecting those in trade-exposed, emissions-intensive industries?
The Minister's time has concluded, and I call the member for Dobell.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why did 94% of the Central Coast package from the Urban Congestion Fund go to one seat, the marginal Liberal seat of Robertson? Is traffic congestion in the rest of the Central Coast not a problem?
The Prime Minister has the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hereby popular demand, Mr Speaker, obviously from those opposite. Mr Speaker, the Urban Congestion Fund is
Members
busting
on
congestion.
my left, the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I'll start again so they can hear me properly, Mr Speaker.
No, we can always hear you. We can always hear you.
I'll speak slowly so they can understand. The Urban Congestion Fund is busting congestion, ensuring vital road projects are getting built. Now, this $4 billion fund is bringing to life 166 crucial projects. 70 of them will start construction this year. 4 are already underway, with geotechnical investigations, Mr Speaker, and other preparatory work underway on many, many more. Mr Speaker, we took these projects to the Australian people on May 18. Remember that date, May 18, and guess what? We got elected. We got elected, Mr Speaker. Now, in the same way that Labor had, to our knowledge, to our understanding, I'm not quite sure of all of their policies, of all their promises, but to our knowledge, 66 election commitments in small-scale urban projects, 100%. That means every single one of them were in Labor or Target seats.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. The question's in 2 parts. All parts refer to the Central Coast, and the Deputy Prime Minister is yet to refer to it at all. I don't know how it can be directly relevant if both the first part and the second part of the question only refer to the Central Coast. He's been asked by a Central Coast member. It's reasonable that he be relevant to it.
Yeah, just before I call the Deputy Prime Minister, I was listening very carefully for that very point, because I thought when the question was asked, that particular point of order was at risk of being invoked. But listening to the Deputy Prime Minister when he's explained essentially that there are election commitments and that is really the answer. But they won't. That's our whole point. No, well, I don't actually. I mean, if you want me to take on the added responsibility of vetting every fact that's said in this place, I'm going to be looking at a lot of copy. But I think the Deputy Prime Minister's, in answering the question, is giving an answer to the member for Dobell. He doesn't have to mention the Central Coast or the seat of Robertson. I think he he is being relevant to the question. On the point of order.
On the point of order, the Urban Congestion Fund was in the government's budget. These were not election commitments. This was something that was announced in the budget and then allocated. These were not election commitments. That is our whole point.
Yes, sure. Okay, then. But the point the Deputy Prime Minister's making, nonetheless, is giving a, put it this way, is he is, in answering the question, giving it an explanation for how the projects were decided. Deputy Prime Minister's.
I'll be very quick. These are decisions of government. They're not competitive grants. We took into account other spending within the infrastructure program. That's $100 billion over 10 years, a record amount of money, thanks to the Liberal and Nationals government, thanks to the fact that we get our books balanced, unlike those opposite. When was the last time there was a surplus? 1989 under those. We take into account demand. We take into account population growth, appreciating the fact that the Central Coast is a large growing population. But nearly, and this is important, I hear the opposition leader screaming out, but this is important. No, it's not a joke, it's the truth. Nearly all road and rail projects are decisions of government, as they have been for decades under both coalition and Labor governments.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. How is the Morrison government delivering on its balanced plan to support our resources industry and the local jobs it creates, especially with exports? And how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Minister for Resources.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for his question? And the honourable member's constituents know it is our balanced plan for the resources sector which delivered not only for the member for Dawson jobs, but support for the coal sector. The member for Dawson understands it is our balanced plan that is delivering jobs right across Australia. Now, the resources sector, Mr Speaker, accounted for 8% of Australia's GDP, 59% of Australian export earnings in 2018-19, nearly 245,000 Australians at the end of 2018-19 were employed. That is 2%, roughly 2%, 1 in 50 of every individual that you run across who is working is employed in the resources sector. Now, what does that mean for our country? Well, it means that the coal industry alone contributes more than $6 billion every year in royalties and accounts for over 54,000 direct jobs, with the majority in regional areas. Now, we continue to open up new resource basins around Australia, like the Galilee and the Beetaloo. We continue to support these high-wage jobs right around the country. But I'm asked about alternatives, Mr Speaker. And to my surprise, on the weekend in The Australian, I note the intrepid reporter Greg Brown had a report, a secret plan for Labor MPs to cap coal exports. Now, Mr Speaker, I know those opposite are keen on a cap-and trade system, but I didn't know they were keen on a cap-on trade system, a cap-on trade, because a cap-on trade is a cap on jobs. A cap on trade is a cap on exports. A cap on trade is a cap on opportunity. A cap on trade is a cap on opportunities for our youth to be employed right around the country. Now, on this side, Mr Speaker, we know that Australia is a trading nation. For Australia, trade means jobs, more trade means more jobs, and it is our balanced plan that is continuing to deliver those jobs right across this country, and the member for Dawson and his constituents absolutely know it. That's why during the election he had people in CFMEU T-shirts signing up in his shopping centres, signing his petitions because they support high-paid jobs. We support those jobs. We are supportive of those opportunities. Those opposite want every worker in this country lined up, cap in hand to the Leader of the Opposition and saying, please, sir, can I keep my job?
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why was over $700 million, almost 1/4 of all the funds allocated from the Urban Congestion Fund, channelled to 3 Liberal seats of Higgins, Deakin and Latrobe? Is there no congestion in Cooper, in Wills, Holt, Hotham, in Gellibrand, in Lawler or in Maribyrnong?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, as I gave in an answer to an earlier question, Mr Speaker, I ran through the considerable commitments the government made to electorates that are held by Labor members, Mr Speaker. At the last election, we took a plan to the Australian people, and that was to deal with congestion busting in our cities. Now, Mr Speaker, we believe that's an important issue to try and get people home sooner and safer. And so we put the fund together of $4 billion, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we could address those issues in our cities and in our communities. But what's more important, Australians trusted our plan because they know we can deliver our plan, because they know we know how to manage money, Mr Speaker. They heard all the same promises, Mr Speaker, from the Labor Party at the last election. They promised to spend some $250 million on various projects around the country. They promised to spend billions of dollars here or there and everywhere. But, Mr Speaker, they didn't trust Labor to deliver on these things because they know they cannot trust Labor with money.
The member for Mallee has the call.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. How is the Morrison-McCormack government delivering on its balanced plan to deliver for rural and regional Australia, and how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mallee for her question, Mr Speaker, a fine advocate for her fine seat in regional Victoria. Through her advocacy and this government's strong economy, we are delivering on election commitments that we made in Mallee. And the member for Mallee, she's a fighter. She's a fierce advocate for improved medical services, for improved infrastructure services and better delivery for regional Victoria and elsewhere, Mr Speaker. We know, across the parliament, I will say, Mr Speaker, that better roads save lives, and people living in and travelling throughout Mallee deserve better roads, better infrastructure, the safest possible journey to get to where they need to be sooner, but perhaps most importantly, Mr Speaker, safer. In Mallee alone, as part of our election commitments, we've invested $6 million for black spot road upgrades. Black spot upgrades which are going to take away those deadly intersections to make sure we improve those sections of road, Mr Speaker, which have proved so costly to so many families in the past. $91 million in Roads to Recovery funding over 9 councils. Now, Roads to Recovery funding is a function of this government, thought up by this government, being delivered by this government, Mr Speaker. It goes back years. It's brought such benefits to regional areas. We committed $10 million to installing passing lanes and introducing 2 new intersections along the Calder Highway to Mildura. This investment in road safety is also improving freight efficiency for local producers, with more than 280 heavy vehicles utilising this section of the highway each and every day. We want to increase it, Mr Speaker, so that the fine food and fibre from the Mallee region gets to port quicker, gets to market faster. Ensuring steady flow of traffic and improving conditions for freight and transport networks on the intersecting Sturt Highway is crucial to the broader road safety measures that we are introducing, that we are investing in, that part of our $100 billion record amount of infrastructure that we're doing right across the nation. $60 million for a new bridge in Swan Hill. I know how much the member has fought for this, Mr Speaker. We committed $2 billion to the Mildura Airport. Now, that was for an instrument landing system, Mr Speaker. The Mayor of Mildura, Simon Clements, said it was the best investment that any government of any political persuasion had ever done for Mildura, and already the number of inquiries for pilot training academies, Mr Speaker, is writ large, making sure that that investment is well spent. Now, I was asked about alternative questions, alternative approaches, Mr Speaker. Those opposite ignore regional Australia. But they do at their peril, Mr Speaker, because when the regions are strong, so too is our nation. When our farmers are at our best, so too is our nation. When our truck drivers can transport the goods around our nation in a more efficient and timely manner, then our nation benefits. But those opposite, well, they just want to impose a carbon tax. They want to make it harder for farmers. They want to make it harder for our truckies who deliver everything in this nation except babies, Mr Speaker. They need the support, and they need the help, and they'll get it from this side, Mr Speaker.
Has concluded. The member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can you confirm that 42% of the Urban Congestion Fund for South Australia is allocated to the marginal seat of Boothby? Is there no traffic congestion in the seats of Hindmarsh, Spence or Kingston?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I refer the member to my earlier response when I listed quite a number of Adelaide and other South Australian seats which are benefiting from the investments of this government. But I've got to say, the member for Boothby does a fantastic job, Mr Speaker. You'll find no better advocate for dealing with the issues and challenges in the electorate of Boothby than the member for Boothby. And, Mr Speaker, that is why the member for Boothby was re-elected, Mr Speaker, because she understands what's going on in her community and she fights for her community and she has the ear of a government, Mr Speaker, that can deliver for the people of Boothby, and that's why the people of Boothby made the right decision by re-electing the member for Boothby and all the other members, Mr Speaker, who sit on this side of the House, because they know when our government makes a promise to Australians, we keep it, and that's what our government is doing.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's policies, clear and balanced plans, are providing certainty for Australian families and business both now and into the future? And how does this compare against the risk of alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
And I thank the member for Goldstein for his question, and I commend him on his excellent piece in the Weekend Press, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our government, as I just said, is getting on with the job on delivering the commitments that we made, that have been able to be delivered because of the strong financial stewardship of this government, which means we can invest in the things that make a big difference to Australians. Mr Speaker, we are getting on with the jobs of putting people into jobs. Mr Speaker, we've seen more Australians get into jobs. We've seen more than 1.5 million people come into jobs, and we've pledged to make another 1.25 million over the next 5 years. Mr Speaker, we're getting Australians into their first homes, as we promised they would do, as I was with the member for Deakin on the week, just last week, as we saw more and more people come through the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme and getting access to the first home. We are putting money back in the pockets of Australians, as we promised, with the tax cuts that we delivered and we are legislated, and that legislated plan, Mr Speaker, delivers more tax relief in the future. We're delivering the infrastructure that we promised to deliver, and that has been the discussion point today in question time. Mr Speaker, we are standing by our farmers and our graziers when it comes to drought and when it comes to flood, Mr Speaker. A year since those terrible floods up in North Queensland, and we continue to stand by them. We're standing by the small business owners with lower taxes, less paperwork, and ensuring they're getting paid on time, as we promised we said we would do. We're increasing the incentives to get apprentices on the tools, Mr Speaker, in those small businesses, and building the skills capabilities of our country for the future in the sectors and the industries that particularly need them, particularly in our defence industries. Mr Speaker, we're keeping Australians safe, as we promised we would do, through our investments in defence, through our investments in border protection, through our investments in law enforcement and counter-terrorism efforts that are keeping Australians safe. We're expanding our borders with our trade, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we create more jobs, and we are protecting our environment with new initiatives on waste management, Mr Speaker, and on reducing emissions, as we said we would do, without increasing taxes. Now, those opposite, Mr Speaker, have a different plan for this country, and the cat was belled on the weekend. Their no plan, zero assessment, zero cost, apparently, a policy of having zero emissions in 2050, Mr Speaker, demonstrates the zero ideas of the Leader of the Opposition, proving that he is the same bill Australia couldn't afford today, Mr Speaker, as the previous Leader of the Opposition was. But, Mr Speaker, that reckless commitment to their uncosted 2050 target betrays something very important. It betrays that the Labor Party is disconnected from the aspirations of Australians, but is hardwired to the shouty voices who sneer at the lively, Mr Speaker, the livelihoods and the jobs of Australians in our suburbs and in rural and regional Australia. They're disconnected from that, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice board.